Hello, Dr. DeVore's APUS history class. This is part 3 of the period 1 lecture. And so today we're going to pick up where we left off. In the last lecture, we talked a lot about the Columbian exchange and that exchange between the New World and Old World and New World, of all these things, such as, the Old World giving, cattle and horses and guns and things like that to the New World, and the New World giving the Old World tomatoes and potatoes and corn, and also the exchanging of diseases and bodily fluids and stuff like that. And now we're going to move on and we're going to continue the lecture. And we're going to talk about the early colonization of the area by Spain and Portugal. Now, you might be going, Portugal? Really? Well, Portugal was one of the major players in the world at the time. They had a massively strong navy. Prince Henry the Navigator was part of building that navy for Portugal and things like that. And then Spain was the other major powerhouse. So England and, places like France, stuff like that will come out later as superpowers. But for right now, if we're talking about Europe, Spain and Portugal are our two big powers. And what do Spain and Portugal have in common, you might ask? And one of those things is they are both part of the Catholic Church. They are both Catholic countries. And because of this, the Catholic Church was very interested and invested in both Spain and Portugal expanding their empires and settling new areas, because they knew when that happened, that would then lead to there being more conversion of indigenous people to Catholicism. Well, what we get as a result of this is that Spain and Portugal are fighting with one another. They're talking about, oh, I should be, in charge of this. You should be in charge of that, so on and so forth. And eventually what happens is that the Pope steps up and he gives us what is known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. And effectively, what the Treaty of Tordesillas does is divide the Western Hemisphere between Spain and Portugal. Now, no one asked the people of the Western Hemisphere if they wanted to be divided between Spain and Portugal. Did the Pope have the authority to do this? No, not really. I mean, the Pope is not in charge of the Western Hemisphere. People in the Western Hemisphere weren't Catholics. They didn't know who the Pope was, but he divides it. And this is where we get a country like Brazil speaking Portuguese as opposed to Spanish, because the Treaty of Tordesillas line, which runs down through Greenland and through the Atlantic, and you can't really see it on this map, but it cuts off part of Brazil, and that meant that whole region became Portuguese. So if you go to Brazil today, they speak Portuguese, not Spanish, because of this Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, the Portuguese Empire will die out eventually, and the Spanish Empire will take over. But for the time being, the Portuguese do have that presence in the Western Hemisphere, and certainly in a lot of islands. The Portuguese were also very prominent in the slave trade on the western coast of Africa. They also have a lot of prominence in the island nations, or islands off the coast of Africa, the islands in the Mediterranean, and other islands out in the Atlantic Ocean as well. Now, Spain, when people talk about this, we're not talking about England or France yet. England and France will come later to the New World. So it's going to be 1607 before England establishes a permanent colony. So Christopher Columbus in 1492, but then England in 1607, 1492 to 1607. That's over 100 years, right? It's 115 years. So that's quite a big span, 115 years. That's an entire life period, a couple generations, if not multiple generations. Now, a lot of people think that the first settlers in North America were the English, and they think that because of Jamestown being established in 1607. And Jamestown and the English settlements will eventually become part of the 13 original colonies. And that's why a lot of people think that, England was the first here. But in reality, in 1565, the Spanish were the first, and they settled an area called St. Augustine down in Florida. And St. Augustine, it made sense. The Spanish were in this region. They were in the Gulf of Mexico, and they found an area, and it became St. Augustine. So that is the oldest European settlement in the New World, was St. Augustine. There's also some older settlements, older than Jamestown, in the New Mexico region, where the Pueblo Indians and such were. The Pueblo Revolt, 1608, means the Spanish were already there. But we don't often get that because of this belief that the English settled America. Now, a part of the Spanish system in the New World was what they called the encomienda system. And the way you got to think of an encomienda system is it's a lighter version of slavery. It's still very bad, but a lighter version of slavery in that indigenous people would be given to a conquistador. The conquistador would be in charge of his encomienda. And his encomienda was basically either farmland, it could have been mining land for silver, it could have been sugar farm plantation. It could be any sort of place where the indigenous people were expected to work for their conquistador master in exchange for being protected, civilized, and converted to Catholicism. This system often led to abuses by the conquistadors. And what we're going to get out of this encomienda system is something called the Black Legend. And the Black Legend basically dictates, and it's had long ramifications in how the world has viewed Spain and the Spanish Empire. But it basically viewed that the Spanish were just ruthless in their approach to dealing with the native population. And yes, some were. So there are hints and truths to the Black Legend. For instance, there were natives that were decapitated. There were cases of starvation. And obviously, there is the smallpox and disease issue. Now, that does not mean that all the conquistadors were horrible people, but certainly they are conquering another people, which does kind of throw them on the bad guy side, if we're being quite frank with it. But this is Native American slave labor, and so these indigenous people would work, and then they were expected to give a tribute of sorts back to their encomienda master. Some of times this resulted in starvation. Not all the time. It kind of depended on where you're at. Now, if you were a sugar plantation worker or a miner, for silver, these were horrible jobs, especially both of them are very bad. Mining, you get stuff in your lungs. And then sugar, two things. Handling sugar cane, if you've ever handled sugar cane, they'll rip your hands apart, make them bleed and things like that. And then also when stored improperly, sugar can become explosive. And so sometimes the grain storage or sugar storage areas would explode. Now, the Spain said that this was good for the people, the indigenous people, because they were converting them to Catholicism. They were civilizing them. The indigenous people never asked for this. They weren't like, hey, come convert us. Hey, civilize us. They didn't want that. But the Spanish did it anyway. That was their justification. And in fact, a lot of the times when the Spanish would take over a place, they would read what was called a requerimiento, and the requerimiento justified Spanish conquest, saying that we're here to convert you, save you, civilize you, etc. Now, one of the things that you get because of this, the system of, the Spaniards, again, we mentioned this briefly before, and this is the simplified version. I'm not going to go down the list of all the different racial classifications because there are certainly a lot of them. But you do get an intermixing of Spanish conquistadors and settlers mixing in with the native population. So the two sort of general categories are mestizo, which are people of a mixed Indian and European heritage. So this is someone from Europe has gotten with someone from the indigenous cultures of the New World and produced a child. That child is called a mestizo. These mestizos will be very important later on in Latin American politics because they won't be allowed the right to vote. They'll be part of the rebellions against Mexican governments, but that's further down the road into the 18 and early 1900s. Mulattoes are a term that has a negative connotation in the United States, but the reality of it is mulatto, when it comes to the Spanish Empire, simply refers to someone of a mixed heritage between a white European and an African American slave. So effectively half black and half white. And the Spanish system gets very much more nuanced after this. For instance, if a mestizo and a mulatto got together and had a child, they would be a completely different racial classification. One of the interesting things about Spanish New World, though, is that you could actually buy your whiteness. And what I mean by that is the Catholic Church would sell you a certificate that could move you up in a racial class. So if you saved enough money and you were an indigenous person, you could buy your way up to another class. If you were, half black and half white, you could buy your way up to another class. This is an insane system, but it was done to make money for the Catholic Church, and it really just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us in America in the 21st century, but it is definitely a thing that went on in the Spanish Empire. Okay, moving on. The screen's in the way real quick. So there is going to be there will be fighting back. And again, I said 1608, I meant 1680 for the Pueblo Revolt. The Pueblo Revolt is often what we bring up in APUS history to show that there was resistance to Spanish rule in the New World. And in this case, what the Spaniards did, and we're talking about Native Americans living up here in modern day New Mexico. So North America, the United States of America, modern day. We have to kind of think about northern New Spain, places like New Mexico, even Texas, Arizona region, even California to a degree. The coast of California had people, but other parts didn't. We have to think about how there wasn't a lot of Spaniards in that region because primarily there wasn't a lot for them to find or do or make money off of. And so they kind of avoided it for the most part. But in this region, the Spanish come in, they bring their monks, the Catholic Church, they try to change Native American beliefs, they try to change how they worshiped, how they lived, and the Pueblo Indian are going to revolt. And Pope down here, P-O-P-E, apostrophe S, Pope's rebellion in 1680 sees the Pueblo Indian revolt, causing the deaths of hundreds of Spanish colonists and the destruction of Catholic churches in the region. So we often bring this up to show signs of resistance, of Native American or indigenous resistance to European settlement. This is an organized rebellion from the Pueblo Indians against the Spanish. And what was at the core of this is that the Native American people, these indigenous people, wanted to maintain their customs, their politics, their culture. They wanted to be free of the Spanish. The Spanish, in this case, are seen as conquerors, invaders. They are not traditional. So this is no different than what will go on in other countries, the conquest, etc. It's just here we're dealing with Native American populations and the Spanish Empire. So now I said that there's this black legend of the Spanish Empire in the New World. And part of that is because it was at times quite ruthless. But that doesn't mean that no one was talking about it at the time. This isn't something that we just decided that we were going to talk about in, 1995 or the 2000s, or, because people would use the quote unquote, oh, you're trying to change history and be, for the lack of better words, woke or something like that. No, this is something that was debated at the time, actually. And there were debates that occurred over how Native Americans should be treated and how, civilized they actually were compared to Europe. Because as I mentioned, the Aztec Empire and these empires, these were civilized empires. They had laws, they had rules, they had structures, they had infrastructure. I mean, they had waterworks, they had aqueducts. So these are not people, these are not, what would be, these are not, I think, as some people want to think, like wild cavemen running around with no law and order. These people have a civilization. It's just their civilization is different than the European civilization. So there were two major players in this debate, and both of them were involved in the Catholic Church, and one of them was involved more with the Spanish government. Juan de Sepulveda, more involved with the Spanish government, wrote The Just Cause for War Against the Indians. And basically what he said is that the Spanish Empire was justified in Spanish colonization of the Americas. Their treatment of the Indians was justified. They had to civilize, convert these indigenous populations at all costs. And if that meant that some of them died, well, so be it. His adversary, or the person that would present the other side of the argument, was a man by the name of Bartolome de las Casas, who in 1552 published a short account of the destruction of the Indies. And something pretty cool, it's closed right now for remodeling. They're building a whole new museum, but there's actually some work by Bartolome de las Casas from the 1500s that you can go look at and even touch at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So you can actually hold a book or look at a book from the 1500s right here in our city. And that book deals with how Native Americans or indigenous people in New Spain were treated. And he basically, in this short essay, criticized that the Spanish were destroying these people. They were destroying their customs. This was not the way of the Catholic Church. This is not what they should be doing. They should be far more lenient. They should treat the indigenous population nicer than they were doing here. Well, in the end, for the most part, Sepulveda wins out because turns out Bartolome de las Casas' version is a lot harder to maintain the peace as opposed to an iron fist. And that's going to be one of the big differences between the Spanish Empire and the English Empire in the New World. The Spanish are going to rule their empire with an iron fist, meaning they are going to be in complete control and you have to do what they say. The English are going to be different. And that brings us to our next point and the final point of this lecture that we'll spend a little time on. One of the big things that you do in AP US history regarding this period, and it's pretty much one of the sole things that you do, is that you're going to compare how these European countries colonize the New World. So one of the major differences is that the English who come over are Protestants. They are not Catholics. And England will eventually challenge Spanish colonization of North America. So for about 100 years or so, Spain had its sort of free will to do whatever in North America. Now, it limited most of its conquering down here in Latin America. You can see on this map at the bottom, you have the Spanish Empire going up into close to California, parts of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and then over here in Florida eventually. But you're also going to get eventually the English come in. That's where we're going to get the 13 original colonies over on the East Coast. And then the French also come in. And so, and I won't forget about the Dutch. The Dutch are going to be active in the New York region and places like that, but they will eventually go away. So we don't really worry about the Dutch too much. Instead, we worry about the French, the English, and the Spanish. And very quickly, and we'll talk about this again in the future, but I'm going to introduce it here. The English were not concerned with converting the indigenous population. The English basically pushed the indigenous population away, said, we don't want anything to do with you, we're good. The English brought over family units. The Spanish did not. The Spanish brought over just men mostly. The French also just brought over men. Now, when we talk about this, you have the English over here, you have the Spanish over here, and somewhere in the middle, you have the French. So the English did not rule with an iron fist. They let their colonists sort of do whatever they wanted to do. They came over in family units, started farms, they started small towns, etc. The Spanish rule with an iron fist. You have to be approved to go to the New World. You have to abide by the Catholic Church and Spanish law. There are no family units. There's the encomienda system. It's much more buttoned down. The French brought over some family units. It was still mostly single men, and they really didn't establish cities and things like that, or even really much of a government in the New World. Instead, they established more of a fur trapping, natural resources sort of empire. And you can see that they're mostly, even though they do extend down here into the Louisiana region, and there will be lots of trade and commerce in Louisiana because it's an important port, this area is up here in Canada and the upper Midwest are going to be more about fur trapping and trading and things like that, as opposed to what the English were doing, which were not dealing with Native Americans. The French did, and they would intermarry just like the Spanish. But unlike the Spanish, the French didn't rule with that iron fist. So a little bit of differences there, and we'll explore those more in the future. So Spain and Portugal formed and used Native Americans as labor. And going back, that encomienda system, as it slowly kills out the native population, is what is going to lead us down the path to African-American slaves appearing in the New World. France, Holland, and Spain, Holland being the Dutch, they actually traded with the Native American tribes. They intermarried with the Native American tribes. The English did not. The English sort of put a wall up. Did that mean that no Englishman ever married a Native person? No, that happened. But most famously, Pocahontas. But it did have this wall between them that didn't exist in the other ones. Now, the main reason for colonization through all of this is mercantilism. For the Spanish, it was making money through gold and the mining and everything else. The English, it was through land. It's going to be a little different. Access to raw materials. Mercantilism, this economic system by which you make money off of colonies. Colonies exist to enrich the mother country. And to give another quick example of that, very much for instance, here we go. You get lumber from New England, right? So you cut down a tree in Massachusetts. You cut down multiple trees in Massachusetts, you put it on a boat, you send it to England. England will then take those raw resources and they'll turn them into furniture, let's say a table. Then that table will be shipped back to the colonies and sold to them. So they're getting their raw materials for the colony and they're selling their goods there. The colonies benefit the mother country. Okay, now that's going to wrap up the lecture for period one. There may be some other videos coming up maybe for it. And then we're going to do a little examination work on that. You need, if you are watching this, to make sure you are registered for My AP Classroom, and you need to make sure that you are on campus. So if you're watching this, you're definitely on campus. If not, we need to figure out what's going on. All right, guys, thank you very much. As always, be safe and make good decisions.